May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and not suffering any economic hardship and able to get out and do whatever you wish within the confines of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. Today we've got chapter 16 of Crooked Cucumber with comments and tangents on those comments. We're going to go right into it after a pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause if you wish, and meditate if you wish. And when you're through, hit unpause, and we will hit the bell to end the meditation, and we'll go right into chapter 16 of Crooked Cucumber. Crooked Cucumber, the life and Zen teaching of Shunryu Suzuki, Chapter 16. Chapter 16, The City, 1968 through 1969. If you want to be a circle, you must first be a square. Back in San Francisco, things were humming. Suzuki students were an active presence at Sokoji all the time, in the Zendo, kitchen, and office. Yvonne Rand, Zen Center's full-time secretary, shared an office with Katagiri. Yvonne was a Stanford graduate. She had met Virginia Baker at a weaving class a couple of years earlier and had become fast friends with the Bakers. Before working for Zen Center, she had taught math at a private school. She was married, had 2 children, loved plants and animals, had a natural tendency to help people, and at 30 years old was efficient and sharp. She was one of those people who Suzuki said were older students the day they arrived. Once she met Suzuki, Yvonne was happy to handle Zen Center's secretarial tasks for a pittance. just to be around him. It was an exciting time to be there at the birth of a monastery. Ivan became a board member virtually overnight, too. Richard would come to the office, joke around, get an update from Ivan, and then be off to Tassajara. Claude was managing 5 rented apartments across the street where Zazen students lived and ate communally. Newcomers, mainly in their 20s, were finding their way up the Sokoji steps to learn about Zen. With all this activity, the rift between Suzuki's Zazen students and the overwhelmed Japanese-American congregation widened. Your life in the hippie age is very different. I think it is very Buddhist-like. Maybe that is why you like Buddhism. But if you become a Buddhist, your life will change more. You will become a super hippie, not a usual one. Your lifestyle looks Buddhist, but that is not enough. When you have a strict practice that doesn't ignore the weak points of your practice, then eventually you will have good practice. More and more you will understand what the Zen masters have said, and you will appreciate their lives. There were plenty of hippies and young people of various descriptions appearing in the San Francisco streets and the Sokoji Zendo. Life at Zen Center was too formal and disciplined for most of them. Doctrinal disputes were common. The air was full of ideas about what was spiritual or what was Zen. The word had a glamour to it and tended to be used freely, as in, that's very Zen. People were making Zen into whatever they wanted. A psychedelic periodical called the San Francisco Oracle had reprinted the Zen Center's Heart Sutra chant card with an overlay of a naked woman lying across it. Zen seemed to be the coolest thing going. Zen Center often acted as an antidote to that assumption. With the silence, stillness, and alertness of Zazen, the almost military crispness of the group, sutra chanting and disciplined atmosphere in the clean building, and the subdued dress and short hair of the older students. "Man, you guys are uptight," said a long-haired, colorfully dressed young college dropout smelling of patchouli oil. "The real Zen's on the street, dancing and getting high. Anyway, your teacher can't be enlightened. He shaves his head, which means that he had to have the idea, I'm going to shave my head, which means his mind wasn't in the clear light." One student had spearheaded a drive to start a Zendo in the Haight-Ashbury. He'd shown Katagiri a proposed space in the Straight Theater. Katagiri was used to hippies, but this was right in the middle of their scene. He told Suzuki that he didn't think the sort of discipline that was needed to study Zen could be sustained there. Students had been talking to Katagiri and Suzuki about psychedelics since 1965. Of the two, Suzuki took it more seriously. Many students who'd come to him in the past few years credited psychedelics with awakening their interest in Buddhism. He was aware that Richard Baker had organized the first major LSD conference in the U.S., at the University of California Extension in San Francisco. The student who was promoting the idea of the Haight-Ashbury Zendo urged Suzuki to try LSD, and finally Suzuki took a capsule of the not yet illegal substance from him. A week later, he decided to flush it down the toilet. A reporter for the biggest underground newspaper in the area interviewed Suzuki at Tassajara. After 5 minutes of talking about LSD, he gave up trying to find out what Suzuki's position was. He said that the best he could come up with was that Suzuki didn't seem to think it was relevant to anything. A Stanford professor told Suzuki that many college students were smoking marijuana all the time and taking LSD. Maybe it was good in some ways for them to experiment, but it was interfering with their studies. What did Suzuki do about this problem? Oh, nothing, said Suzuki. I just teach them how to sit zazen, and they forget about those things pretty soon. Suzuki would occasionally mention that he did not want people to come to the temple while high. At the wedding of a couple who were involved in the psychedelic scene, he said, "Our way is not to seek some deep experience. We accept ourselves just as we are. We do not take drugs. It is superficial." On the whole, though, he seemed quite unconcerned about drugs and alcohol. He saw more pernicious attachments among his students. When he spoke on the precept forbidding consumption or distribution of alcohol or intoxicants, he sometimes gave it a surprising interpretation. This means don't sell Buddhism, or this means don't try to give people some medicine. Don't boast about the superior teaching of Buddhism. Not only liquor, but also spiritual teaching is intoxicating. Allen Ginsberg had come to be recognized as the poet laureate of the beat and a hero of the hippie movement. He had met Suzuki a few times in the early days at the Academy and around Japantown, then later at a major Berkeley poetry conference that Richard had organized. In 1963, Ginsberg took an extensive trip to Asia, during which he investigated Hinduism and Buddhism. In Kyoto, he visited Ruth Fuller Sasaki's temple and sat zazen with his old buddy Gary Snyder for 6 weeks at Oda Roshi's temple in the Daitokji complex. He was delighted with this first experience of zazen and a little miffed at Snyder for not introducing him and Kerouac to zazen years before when they visited Snyder's Marin An, Horse Grove Hermitage in Marin County, one of the first zendos in the West. Upon his return to America, Ginsberg meditated at Sokoji a few times in the fall of 1963. It was a little restrictive for him. He liked to hit cymbals and spontaneously chant and sing Hindu songs during his meditation. But he was always appreciative of the Zen Center practice, and from time to time he recommended that people go there. On January 14, 1967, Ginsberg and Suzuki met again. Some students had brought Suzuki to the Human Being in Golden Gate Park, where tens of thousands of hippies, fellow travelers, and the curious gathered to celebrate, dance, get high, and enjoy the sunshine. As usual, Oksan had tried to stop him, saying he should rest, but it was a free Saturday afternoon, and some students were begging him to go, so he did. Suzuki was welcomed on the platform, where he sat with Ginsberg, Timothy Leary, Gary Snyder, and the poet Michael McClure, among others. A young woman handed him a God's eye, a multicolored hexagonal religious symbol on a stick, allegedly American Indian in origin. After a while, he passed it on, and someone else gave him a flower. He sat there with the flower and enjoyed the flower children, the music, and the idealistic speeches. After a while, Suzuki excused himself and was taken home. Gary Snyder told Ginsberg it was significant that he'd come, a recognition that there was more to the aspirations of youth than hedonism and foolishness. In the spring of 1968, Ginsberg returned to Sokoji to ask for permission to use Suzuki's translation of the Heart Sutra, which he wished to sing in public. "I've looked at all the translations," Ginsberg said, "and am most intrigued with yours. It's so succinct." He called the style telegraphese. Suzuki hadn't even thought of it as a translation. Ginsberg showed him the sutra card the Zazen students used at Sokoji to chant the sutra in Sino-Japanese. There were the Romanized symbols, the Chinese characters, and the basic meanings of the terms in English below that. Suzuki had never intended the English to be chanted. Ginsberg had memorized it and created a melody. He sang his version to Suzuki and asked if it would be all right for him to perform it in public. "Sure," said Suzuki enthusiastically. "Please do. You have the right spirit." An enthusiastic new arrival told Suzuki Roshi he wanted to move into the temple to be closer to him. "That would be good," Suzuki said, "but it would make the other students jealous. So why don't you come to the temple before morning zazen and we'll clean together?" The next morning, he joined Suzuki at 4:15, and they cleaned the zendo and halls and bathrooms till 4:45, when people began to arrive for zazen. They vacuumed, mopped, and dusted. One morning, as they were cleaning, Suzuki excused himself. Suddenly there came a sound of knocking and then a voice calling in Japanese. Suzuki was in the bathroom by his office, brushing what teeth he had left. He went out to the stairway to see what the racket was. He and the student tried to locate the source of the ever-increasing pounding and yelling. Suzuki opened the door to the basement. There was Oksan, full of fury, screaming at him. She'd been locked in all night. The women's club had met the night before, and they had gone around and locked up too thoroughly before they left. She'd been taking a bath while Suzuki was upstairs reading. Finally, he'd gone to sleep, not noticing that she wasn't back. He even got up in the middle of the night to pee as always, not noticing that she wasn't in her bed and her sandals weren't at the door. She yelled at him machine gun fashion. Suzuki realized what had happened and began to laugh. He laughed so hard that foam from the toothpaste ran down from his mouth onto his kimono. The new student got out of there. The world of thinking is that of our ordinary dualistic mind. The world of pure consciousness or awareness is that of Buddha mind. Phenomena in the world of thinking are constantly being named or labeled by our minds. The world of awareness does not label or name, it only reflects. The world of pure consciousness thus includes the opposites in the world of thinking. Alan Watts, Richard D. Martino, and Eric Fromm, among others, had written about Zen and psychoanalysis. Some psychologists and psychiatrists had taken an interest in Zazen and other forms of meditation. Would it help their patients? What did it do? How could it help them learn about consciousness? Dr. Joe Kamiya of the Langley Porter Institute was doing tests on meditators. Some of the students at Zen Center had gone to get hooked up to his electrocephalograph to see how their brain waves changed when they meditated. A number of students had prolonged states of alpha with some theta waves, which were correlated with calm states of mind. Richard Baker and his friend Mike Murphy from Esalen Institute produced theta waves for longer periods, characteristic of the meditation of yogis and Zen masters. Suzuki and Katagiri were wired up as well. Both of them fell asleep immediately. Suzuki respected some aspects of Western psychology and psychotherapy based on what he'd heard from analysts he'd met, but he didn't claim to understand it and didn't compare it to Zen. He made it clear that Buddhism was not a method of self-improvement, but he did speak about body, mind, and will, revealing his own brand of Buddhist psychology and analysis. The way to study Zen is to be aware of yourself, to be careful, to be sincere with yourself. Awareness means that when reading, including Zen materials, your mind should not get caught by any idea. It should remain open. Similarly, with sights and sounds, don't allow your mind's self-awareness to get lost or absorbed. In other words, always remain conscious of what you are doing, of what is going on. A psychiatrist and researcher named Arthur Dikeman had had a life-changing experience in the early 50s when he began to meditate on his own every day in the woods. That led to years of clinical experiments involving meditation. He had been amazed at the results. Many students, all were college students, experienced a striking change of consciousness after only 15 minutes of sitting and staring at a blue vase. What would happen to people who did this all their lives? Wanting to find a qualified meditation teacher, he came to San Francisco to meet with Shunryu Suzuki, whose name had been suggested by colleagues on the East Coast. Dikeman brought a tape recorder, but Suzuki declined to let him use it. He told Suzuki about his research and said he wanted to understand consciousness better. Suzuki told him he should go sit a sesshin with Yasutani in L.A. Not knowing what a sesshin was, Dikeman went and returned some weeks later. He didn't know if Suzuki had sent him because the dates just happened to be right or out of a mischievous desire to test him or throw him to the lions. He'd had amazing experiences of altered states. At one point, his head seemed to disappear. At night, he'd been awakened by what he thought was someone smashing blocks together, only to find that it was the person in the next sleeping bag softly smacking his lips during sleep. While impressed with what happened working with Yasutani on koans, Deichmann continued to seek out Suzuki. "Where he is where I want to be," he told his wife Etta, "in that place of sanity." They went to Tassajara for the summer. They worried that their active younger daughter wouldn't fit in, but there was no problem. They even took her to Suzuki's lectures, and Etta marveled at how her child would calm down and fall asleep. Sometimes in a lecture, Suzuki would say something that seemed to speak directly to Deichmann's conundrums. But more important to Deichmann than Suzuki's words was his attitude, his perspective on the world, his transparency. From what he'd seen and heard at Zen Center, Deichmann knew that Suzuki wouldn't be excited by any special states of mind that came up during his zazen. After a lecture, a student just back from a private 30-day session had asked Suzuki how to maintain the state of mind he'd attained. "Concentrate on your breathing, and it will go away," Suzuki said. In another lecture, Suzuki said, "If you're dissatisfied with your zazen, it shows you have a gaining idea." The next time he talked to Suzuki, Deichmann just told him there seemed to be more clarity, vividness, and intrinsic value in his experience, things he could define. But he felt he'd had a glimpse of Zen. "That might be the case," Suzuki said. But in time, Deichmann got discouraged. He experienced these higher states, but they just passed. What was the use? Suzuki laughed and said, "That's right, no use. All these states come and go. But if you continue, you find there's something underneath. You can't have it because in the act of having it, it's gone," said Deichmann. "Yes, that's right," Suzuki answered. Deichmann continued to come to the West Coast to see Suzuki. As with most people, the reason he came was not the reason he stayed. He remembered what Suzuki said to him when he first came to learn more about consciousness. "I don't know anything about consciousness. I just tried to teach my students how to hear the birds sing." The experience of Zen is not some ecstasy or some mysterious state of mind, but it is a deep joy that is even more than joy. You may have this true experience through some change in your mental state, but a change of mental state is not, strictly speaking, enlightenment. Enlightenment is more than that. That comes with it, but it is more than that. What we experience is joy, our mysterious experience. But something follows. That something which follows, besides this experience, is true enlightenment. So we should not suppose that enlightenment will always be experienced in terms of consciousness. There will always be war, but we must always work to oppose it. One day in late summer of 1968, Suzuki and I sat eating hot dogs in front of the Student Union at the University of California in Berkeley. Before us, a colorful street scene unfolded. Students of every race, jocks and hippies, professors, businessmen and women, and singing, dancing Hare Krishna devotees with backpacks and briefcases, suits and sarongs, long hair abounding. Suzuki was comfortable amidst the ragged revolutionary youth, and they responded well to him. In his brown robes with drooping sleeves, he was immediately identifiable as an ally, not part of the establishment, and people passing him would smile, nod, or sometimes bow. Earlier that day, I had driven Suzuki in pre-dawn darkness to the Berkeley Zendo so he could join the morning schedule and give a talk. Mel Weitzman now lives there and was in charge. We sat around talking till mid-morning when, at Suzuki's request, I had taken him to Telegraph Avenue to visit the bookstores and walk around. People were handing out leaflets promoting Scientology and opposing the war in Vietnam. From the distance, the echoes of an amplified voice approached, blasting out a message from loudspeakers mounted on a van's roof. They were calling for the overthrow of the racist, imperialist, warmongering United States government by any means necessary. "What do you think of that, Roshi?" I said. "Most people aren't even paying attention to it. Quite a country you've come to, huh?" Suzuki kept chewing non-committally. I told Suzuki how almost every guy I knew had avoided the draft, some by pretending to be homosexual or crazy. Many of Suzuki's own students, including Richard and myself, had used their wits to escape the draft. "Roshi, I heard that you opposed the war when you were in Japan. Is that true?" I asked him. "Yes, in a way, but there was not much I could do. We tried to look at the root cause." "Did many priests do that?" "No, not till after the war. Then they all did." "What was it like then?" "Japan was under the spell of some strange idea. There was a lot of confusion." "How did you get away with it? How come you weren't arrested?" "I didn't oppose the government. I just expressed ideas, like if there were peace, that the country and also the government would be stronger, and I encouraged others to think about careless assumptions." "I heard you printed things." "Yes, before the war, but if you saw what I wrote, you wouldn't understand. Not so direct. It was different from your situation here." He sighed. "It would be very hard to explain. You would have to know so much background." A number of Zen students had applied for status as conscientious objectors to military service. Some were doing alternative service in the fire department at Tassajara. As a result, 2 FBI agents showed up at Sokoji one day and interviewed Suzuki. He didn't speak about war and peace in the clear-cut terms that they were used to hearing from Quakers and other pacifist Christians. But he did say that Buddhism sought accommodation rather than conflict, was fundamentally pacifist, and that it was better for monks not to become soldiers. Ironically, in Japan, Buddhism had never been pacifist, and all Buddhist sects had supported the government's wars, as had all organizations, religious or secular. When they asked what he thought about the Vietnam War, he startled them by saying offhandedly, "Oh, yes, I have a son in Vietnam. He's a barber and a mechanic in the U.S. Army. He enlisted. My wife's worried about him, but I think he needed to get out and do something." He showed them a letter he'd just received from Motohiro. The agents finally gave up trying to understand his position. Zen Center continued to provide support for and be host to conscientious objectors. Suzuki was impossible to pin down on most issues and wouldn't support his students' positions if they were simplistic and one-sided, especially if they carelessly threw Buddhism into the mix. He encouraged people to take responsibility for their own actions and not use good deeds as an excuse to avoid facing themselves or as a substitute for practice. Suzuki didn't like hearing the name of Buddhism hastily invoked for noble purposes any more than he liked Buddhist teachings to be twisted to serve greed, hate, and delusion, as had happened in Japan during his lifetime. If students were clear about their motives, he would be supportive. "Roshi, can't I consider my practice to be helping people?" said a woman student after a lecture. "There are so many people who need help, and there is so much to be done. I don't have much time left over to sit zazen or go to Tassajara." "It is very difficult to help people," Suzuki answered. "You may think you're helping them and end up hurting them." He was interested in establishing a way of life that created peace, working on the root cause of war rather than railing against the symptoms. Talking about karma, he said, "You may foolishly try to ignore karma, but this will never work. And if you fight it too much, you will invite destruction that is worse than war. We are actually creating war through our everyday activities. You talk about peace in some angry mood when actually you are creating war with that angry mood. Ugh! That is war. We should know. We should open our Dharma eyes, and together we should help each other forever." In the early 50s, Suzuki had told his young neighbor Yamamura that he longed to go to America to teach about peace and internationalism. But his American students were already politically conscious, some of them active, and he was clearly sympathetic with the peace movement. In 1960, Suzuki had enthusiastically supported the decision of a student named Barton Stone to join a year-long march from San Francisco to Moscow. In 1964, in response to a letter from Barton, Suzuki visited him twice in prison, where he was serving a year for trying to obstruct nuclear testing in the Pacific. Later, when Barton got out of jail and visited Suzuki at Sokoji, Oksan showed him a newspaper clipping from Japan with a photo of her husband marching with other Buddhist priests. There were banners and a large crowd. She said it was a march against nuclear testing in the Pacific. Suzuki joined Richard Baker and some other students for a large demonstration in the fall of 1968, walking up Market Street in peaceful opposition to the war. His decision to go may have been influenced by an emotional exchange he had had with students a few hours earlier. Suzuki was back in town from Tassajara. People in the city missed him, and attendance was high for his Saturday lecture at Sokoji. A young man named John Steiner, who had studied with Suzuki for 2 years, was among those who sat near the front on goza mats. John had been involved in some of the original protests against the war at UC Berkeley 2 years earlier, and like a number of people at the lecture, was planning to attend the protest march that day. Minds buzzed with thoughts of life and death, peace and horror, helplessness and hope. After his talk, Suzuki asked if there were any questions. A woman said, "What is war?" Suzuki pointed to the goza mats. They are about 3 by 6 feet, big enough for 2 cushions. He said that sometimes there are ripples on the rows of straw, and people put their hands down to push the ripples out after they sit down. This works okay on the side, but when there's a ripple between 2 people, it won't smooth out. It just moves toward the other person. Without noticing it, people sometimes push these ripples back and forth toward each other. That is the cause of war. Karma starts with small things, then it accelerates. You should know how to deal with these small difficulties. A fellow in the back spoke up with irritation in his voice. "How come we're meeting here when there's a war going on out there?" Suzuki didn't understand him. John repeated the young man's question more slowly and clearly. He said, "Roshi, how come we're meeting here when there's a war going on out there?" Suzuki smiled. John smiled. Then, as fast as a cat leaping on its prey, Suzuki jumped off the altar platform and was behind John with a stick on his shoulder, loudly saying, "Gasho!" He started hitting him over and over, shouting, "You fools, you're wasting your time." He continued to hit him until John fell forward on the floor. "Dreamer, dreamer, what are you dreaming about?" He got back on the platform and faced the totally stunned audience, most of whom had never heard him raise his voice. The normally tannish skin on his face was white as he said unconvincingly in a barely audible voice, "I'm not angry." And he caught his breath and continued, "How can you expect to do anything in the world when you can't even tie your own shoes?" After the lecture, everyone was fairly quiet. Bob Halpern came up to John and said, "Roshi told you to gasho. You didn't gasho when he hit you." Being hit with the stick isn't a punishment. It's a particular form of communication, and part of the formality is to bow when one receives the stick. To gasho shows respect, expresses the unity of shoulders, stick, and hand, and puts the person in the best position to receive the stick. John had been so shocked he hadn't done his part in the exchange, even though Suzuki had yelled at him to gasho. John went to Suzuki in his office to apologize for not gashoing. Suzuki, in return, apologized to John very sweetly for being so fierce. John had not expected anything from Suzuki. He saw what had happened only in terms of his teacher trying to enlighten him. "The reason I got so," Suzuki said, his sentence trailing off, "is that I was reminded of what I went through in Japan during the war. It brought up that old frustration." John saw in his teacher's eyes a glint of pain. Then Suzuki put his hand on John's shoulder, an unusual gesture for him. The wide sleeves of Suzuki's robes exposed loose skin hanging down from his thin arm. John was struck with Suzuki's age and fragility and could feel his teacher's compassion and suffering. The teaching given by Shakyamuni Buddha during his lifetime was accommodated to each disciple's particular temperament and to each occasion's particular circumstances. For each case, there should be a special remedy. According to circumstances, there should even be teachings other than those which were given by Buddha. In light of this, how is it possible to interpret and pass down an essential teaching that can be applied to every possible occasion and individual temperament? For the first 6 years Suzuki was in America, he and his main students resisted the idea of recording his lectures. What he said was for the moment and for the people at hand. He wasn't codifying his teaching, but working with people day by day, situation after situation. Nevertheless, in 1965, when she was a new student, Marion Derby started recording lectures in Los Altos on her reel-to-reel tape recorder with Suzuki's permission. Also, with his permission, she transcribed them and made the transcripts available. Soon after that, they started doing the same in San Francisco. In the summer of 1966, Marion's parents came to visit. They wanted to check out this Zen teacher, to see whom Marion had brought into her home and into the lives of their grandchildren. They met Suzuki and were delighted with him. Marion's father drove him back to San Francisco to get to know him better. He asked Suzuki what his personal ambition in life was, and Suzuki said, "I'd like to write a book." When her father passed this on, Marion took it seriously and asked Suzuki if she could put a book together from his morning talks. He was enthusiastic. So every Thursday morning, after the group left, she'd read to him from her edited transcripts. Marion loved the way Suzuki would sit with folded legs on her sofa in front of the crackling fireplace, his robes tucked under his legs, the aroma of coffee and cinnamon rolls in the air. The purpose of studying Buddhism is not to study Buddhism, but to study ourselves. That is why we have teaching. But the teaching is not ourselves. It is some explanation of ourselves. To study the teaching is to know yourselves. That is why we do not ever attach to the teaching or to the teacher. The moment you meet a teacher, you should leave your teacher, and you should be independent. You want a teacher so that you can be independent. So you study yourselves. You have the teacher for yourselves, not for the teacher. Did I say that? He'd often comment after Marion had read him an excerpt. Marion told Suzuki that Richard was opposed to the idea of her doing the book. He thought she was too new a student. Suzuki suggested she pass the manuscript on to Richard so he could edit it. In March of 1967, Marion gave the completed manuscript to Richard, which she had titled Beginner's Mind. Much to Marion's frustration, it took him months to get around to looking at it. When he did read it the following fall, he agreed it was good material for a book, after more work. Marion let go of the project. Richard found himself too busy to take it on, so he offered it to a student named Peter Schneider, who had editing experience. Peter turned down the task since he was fully occupied as director of Tassajara. In the spring of 1968, Richard turned the manuscript over to his good friend Trudy Dixon, who, like Richard, had edited Suzuki's lectures for the Wind Belt. Trudy took on the task even though she had 2 small children, had undergone surgery for breast cancer, and was in poor health. She threw herself completely into it, listening to the original tapes, painstakingly working on the material word by word, thought by thought, organizing it, and conferring often with Richard and occasionally with Suzuki directly. Around this time, a Zen student came up to Richard on Bush Street and said he'd heard that Richard was going to Japan. That's how Richard learned of Suzuki's next plan for him. He went right into Sokoji and asked Suzuki about it. Suzuki had a number of reasons for sending him. He said he wanted Richard to experience Zen practice in a Japanese setting and to get a taste of Japanese culture. He wanted him to go to Eiheiji, study with various good teachers, learn tea ceremony, and go to no plays. Suzuki didn't make it public at the time, but he considered this a necessary part of Richard's preparation to someday succeed him as a teacher and maybe even as the abbot of Zen Center. Suzuki also said he wanted to dislodge Richard from his excessive responsibilities and give other students a chance to run things. Richard was so dominant and his mind worked so fast that it was hard for others to develop leadership skills in his presence. Some people like Silas would get a chance to do things without so much conflict and competition with Richard. In addition, Suzuki did not hide another reason. I can't control him, he said, so I'm going to give him a big problem. I'm going to throw him in the ocean. The most astonishing purpose that Suzuki had in sending Richard to Japan was to reform Japanese Buddhism, one of his lifelong goals. He wanted to bust up the fossilization of Zen in his homeland with influence from novice American Buddhists who would bring a fresh approach. As usual, he never fully explained his vision or how he saw this sea change in ancient institutions coming about. Hundreds of people came to Richard's going-away party. Lou Harrison's Chinese music ensemble played, followed by Mel Weitzman's recorder trio, and then there was dancing to a rhythm and blues band. Richard in Virginia stood for a while talking to Suzuki and Oksan. After clowning around, pretending to dance like the students, the Suzukis went home early. Many of those present owed a lot to Richard. He'd gotten them into Tassajara or out of the draft, helped foreign students stay in the country, helped people get jobs, and when it was really important, arranged for Suzuki to see them right away. He'd been everywhere at once, and now he was going away. People worried what Zen Center would be like without him. On October 23, 1968, Richard sailed for Japan with his wife Virginia and daughter Sally. He took with him the completed manuscript for Beginner's Mind, which he had further edited and gone over with Suzuki. He was going to seek a publisher in Japan, and he wrote the introduction on board as the ship headed toward the land of his teacher. Trudy Dixon had been doing graduate studies in philosophy at UC Berkeley, specializing in Heidegger and Wittgenstein when her husband Mike first took her to Sokoji in 1962 to hear Suzuki lecture. Mike was a student at the San Francisco Art Institute. They arrived late and stood in the back of the Zendo. Suzuki embarked on an unusual line of thought that evening. He compared the practice of Zen with the study of philosophy, expressing one's truth in one's whole body and mind instead of thinking and being curious about the meaning of life and death. He said he'd had a good friend in Japan who was a philosopher. Ultimately, his intellectual pursuits didn't satisfy him, and he killed himself. At exactly that point in the lecture, Suzuki looked intently at Trudy. Trudy could not get that experience out of her mind. She and Mike continued coming to lectures and soon decided to start practicing with Suzuki. They became close disciples. In Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, as the book came to be called, Trudy put her whole being into expressing the essence of Suzuki's teaching. After she passed the manuscript on to Richard, she concentrated on taking care of herself at her home in Mill Valley and dealing with her approaching death. She remained cheerful on the outside, but her mind was possessed by fear, which she revealed to her analyst. After an operation, her lungs filled with liquid, and she couldn't breathe. She struggled for breath with all the energy she could find until she went beyond thoughts, words, and fear into what she called breath, struggle, samadhi. After she had undergone 5 difficult days of recovery, Mike brought Suzuki and Oksan to visit her. She said the sight of them was like seeing the sunrise for the first time. She went to Tassajara and fasted. There she had a powerful, joyous experience that included life and death, health and illness, fear and courage. She said she finally stopped fighting and was accommodating the enemy, as Suzuki had described it. On the verge of death, Trudy had been reborn. Her analyst said that at her next visit, she seemed like a new person, a fearless and radiant woman. To her husband, caretakers, and friends, she became an inspiration. Myself, my body, she wrote, is dissolved in phenomena like a sky's rainbow caught in a child's soap bubble. One day after Zazen at Bill Kwong's Mill Valley Zendo, Betty Warren visited Trudy. She arrived wishing there was something she could do. Trudy burned away Betty's pity with one phrase, referring to her illness as this blessed cancer. On Mondays, Suzuki visited Trudy at her home after giving a talk to Bill Kwong's Zazen group. One day after such a visit, he returned to the car with Bob Halpern. Suzuki's eyes were wet. "Now, there's a real Zen master," he said of Trudy, as he sank into his seat. On July 1st, Trudy's brother drove her to Tassajara. They shared a cup of clear creek water with Suzuki, slept outside in the moonlight, and returned the next day to the hospital. A couple of days later, she came back to Tassajara and practiced Zazen lying on her back in the Zendo with Suzuki and the students. On the 8th, she and her teacher returned to San Francisco. On July 9th, 1969, Mike called Suzuki at Sokoji and told him that Trudy had just died in the hospital too quickly for Suzuki to have gotten there. Suzuki fell apart, crying on the phone, which disturbed Mike. He thought of Suzuki as imperturbable. Suzuki came to the hospital and was composed by then. At Trudy's funeral 2 days later, Suzuki was uncharacteristically emotional. He cried and said, "I never thought I'd have a disciple this great. Maybe I never will again." As is customary, the funeral included an ordination in which Suzuki gave his deceased student the precepts. Then he delivered a eulogy. "Go, my disciple. You have completed your practice for this life and acquired a genuine, warm heart, a pure and undefiled Buddha mind, and joined our Sangha. All that you have done in this life and in your past lives became meaningful in the light of the Buddha mind, which was found so clearly within yourself as your own. Because of your complete practice, your mind has transcended far beyond your physical sickness, and it has taken full care of your sickness like a nurse. A person of joyful mind is contented with his lot. Even in adversity, he will see bright light. He finds the Buddha's place in different circumstances, easy and difficult. He feels pleasure even in painful conditions and rejoices. For us, for all who have this joy of Buddha mind, the world of birth and death is the world of nirvana. The compassionate mind is the affectionate mind of parents. Parents always think of the growth and welfare of their children to the neglect of their own circumstances. Our scriptures say, Buddha mind is the mind of great compassion. The magnanimous mind is as big as a mountain and as wide as an ocean. A person of magnanimous mind is impartial. He walks the middle way. He is never attached to any side of the extreme aspects of things. The magnanimous mind works justly and impartially. Now you have acquired the Buddha mind and become a real disciple of the Buddha. At this point, however, I express my true power. Then Suzuki let out a long, mighty roar of grief that echoed through the cavernous auditorium. When you try to do something, you lose it because you are concentrated on one out of 1,000 hands. You lose 999 hands. Before you try, you have it. Abruptly, a demand had come from Sokoji's board of directors in the spring of 1969. Choose us or them. Suzuki had hoped the two groups would grow together and learn to coexist in harmony, but the divide between them had only grown deeper. Students were no longer invited to the congregation's festive events, except for a few old-timers like Claude, Betty, and Della. Suzuki still thought rapprochement was possible, but the board was firm. They no longer wanted a priest with divided loyalties. They wanted Suzuki to stay, but even more, they wanted a priest who was theirs. Their new temple wouldn't be built for years, and they did not wish to rent the Zendo to Zen Center anymore. There were too many students. Zen Center had become too big and busy and was completely overshadowing the Japanese congregation. While some of the congregation members respected the students' sincerity, many didn't feel at home in their own temple. The old caretaker, who never had a smile for anyone and whom some students were afraid of, was the most outspoken supporter of the students. Suzuki's close friend, George Hagiwara, now president of the congregation, was supportive of Suzuki as well, but he knew it was a lost cause. Suzuki said, 80% of the problem is long hair and unusual clothing. The younger Japanese members were more understanding, but the elders ran Sokoji. He said that the Issei, the first-generation Japanese Americans, had a Meiji Buddhist approach. They admired the progress of the West, yet clung to a type of Shinto nationalistic Buddhism focused on making offerings to the spirits of ancestors. Suzuki said he came to America to bring the pure way of Zen Buddhism. Rumi Kawashiri, whose family belonged to Sokoji, wrote a college paper called Sokoji and Zen Center. That year, Suzuki told her that he taught his Zen Center students the fundamentals of Buddhism, while his intent with the congregation was to point out the folly of their mixed-up understanding and strong attachment to their own views and way of life. That didn't increase his popularity. He was harder on them than he had been on his congregation back at Rinso-in. Suzuki further said that the best hope for the congregation was in the Sunday school and with the young in general. The youth liked him, but they were not enthusiastic about Zen. As in Japan, they thought Zen was for old folks and ancestors. He wouldn't give up on pure Zen, so the congregation gave up on him. At the board meeting, Suzuki didn't say anything in his own defense. One relatively new member, a man who didn't often come to the temple, expressed an interest in being president of the Japanese congregation. Suzuki thought the man was getting in over his head and encouraged him to reconsider. The man responded by spearheading the move to oust Suzuki, bringing things to a head. Suzuki gave up, saying that maybe it was better to defer to those who wished him to leave. He confided to his disciple Peter Schneider that he had finally been given an excuse to quit. Katagiri offered to stay, but he was told that if he planned to continue working with the Zen students, the congregation didn't want him, so he resigned with Suzuki. Okusan was distraught, but George Hagiwara told her it was all for the best and not to worry. One evening after Zazen, Bob made up some reason to stay and talk with Suzuki. Suzuki served Bob tea, confiding that he was having a hard time writing to his old supporter Guido at headquarters, the man who'd sent him over and one of the few who he felt understood what he was doing. He wanted to send a letter of resignation, but he didn't know what to say. Bob suggested that Suzuki call him on the phone right then. It was a novel idea to Suzuki. He reached Guido, talked to him for a few minutes, and got his blessing. Afterwards, he got out some special manju and gave Bob all he wanted. We should follow the original way of Zen, which goes beyond Tassajara practice or city practice. At a general meeting of the membership, it was decided that Zen Center would look for its own place, with all the problems that would entail. Suzuki asked Claude and Silas to look for a residential building for the Zen Center, since they both dealt in the worlds of business and property. Suzuki would soon retire from his position at Sokoji to concentrate on working with his students and disciples. Eventually, Claude and Silas found such a place. At the corner of Page and Laguna Streets in San Francisco's Western Addition stood a handsome 3-story red brick building. It had been a Jewish woman's residence called Emmanuel. In the summer of 1969, it was for sale. Claude, Silas, and Suzuki walked up the steps and between 2 columns to a solid double front door with upper panes of thick, translucent glass. An older woman invited them in. The entryway had a high ceiling and opened into a wide hall with benches. A chandelier and sconces were unlit, but indirect light entered through the windows from a courtyard garden. To the left of the entryway were offices, and to the right was a large room lined with arched double windows. The building was magnificent, spacious, sturdy. "Let's get it," Suzuki said, and he started looking around. The next time they went to the building on Page Street, 50 other students joined them to view their prospective home. They all walked the 15 blocks together. It was perfect, ready to go without any remodeling. There was a large dining room and a vast meeting room in the basement that could be used as a zendo right away. Everyone was impressed with the quality of the details, the built-in wooden cabinets and trim, the ironwork, and the view from the walkway on the roof. This gracious building had been designed by Julia Morgan, the architect of Hearst Castle and many other acclaimed buildings in California. Marion Derby and Chester Carlson, a founder of Xerox and the single largest donor toward the purchase of Tassajara, provided the down payment, and the Bank of Tokyo offered generous financing. Starting with the first month, all payments were met by modest resident rents and members' dues. On November 15, 1969, students helped Suzuki and Oksan carry their few possessions to the waiting cars, and they said goodbye to the home they'd lived in for 10.5 years. An official stepping down ceremony would take place later, but on this day he offered incense at Sokochi's altars, bowed to the building from the sidewalk, and rode away. Oksan was sobbing, feeling rejected. They had tried so hard to take good care of Sokochi and the congregation. The Page Street building had residential space for up to 75 people, large communal bathrooms, and a second-floor suite that was perfect for the Suzukis with 3 rooms and a bath. Most of the students who had been living in the apartments across the street from Sokochi moved in. At last, Suzuki had the residential center in San Francisco that he'd been talking about since he came. There was a lot to do, tatamis and bells to buy, altars to build, walls to paint, especially the zendo walls, which had a candy cane motif. Hagiwara personally provided ceremonial equipment for the Buddha Hall. At 5 p.m., Suzuki walked slowly down the wide central stairway, followed by a student carrying a burning stick of incense held high. After offering incense at simple altars in the kitchen, the Buddha Hall, and the basement zendo, Suzuki and his students sat zazen together. Not one period had been missed in the transition. First things first. We say our practice is the ornament of Buddha. Even though students don't know what Buddhism is, if they come to some beautiful Buddha hall, they will naturally have some feeling. But essentially, for Buddhists, the real ornaments of the Buddha hall are the people who practice there. Each one of us should be, a beautiful flower, and each of us should be Buddha leading people in our practice. In January 1970, the new building was officially opened and named the Maha Bodhisattva Zendo. On the main floor, near the front door, the white-walled, arch-windowed Buddha hall contained a fine maple altar built by a student. The room was covered with tatami, except for an aisle of the original reddish tile around the edge. Over 100 students now resided in the neighborhood of Page and Laguna, and people drove in from around the Bay Area for zazen and visits. There were 4 zazen periods a day, 3 services, 2 meals in the dining room. Everyone participated in meal preparation, dishwashing, and building cleanup. They had a library, a laundry room, and a shop. Claude said he was almost embarrassed to be in such comfortable surroundings. The old student should lead the new students so they can practice our way more easily, but without telling them this way or that way. You should do this or you shouldn't do that. And our daily life in this building, extended from our zazen practice, should include a good relationship with our neighbors. Someone may have a beautiful nose, but it should not be fixed upside down. To practice being good neighbors, Sangha members swept the sidewalks daily and planted trees, as on Bush Street. Students were asked not to jaywalk. A neighborhood association had formed, and Suzuki suggested that only 1 or 2 members of Zen Center join it, and mainly listen at the meetings. The students, many of them idealistic, college-educated, young, liberal do-gooders, now found themselves learning how to live in a predominantly black neighborhood on the edge of one of the most dangerous areas in San Francisco. Japantown had also been near the Fillmore, but it was safer and had provided a type of invisible support. In this new neighborhood, there were muggings, even murders. Catty-corner from the new building was a grocery store that sold canned goods, cigarettes, and liquor. The Chinese proprietor had died in a robbery there, and his wife had shot and killed 2 robbers since then, one of them soon after the Zen Center moved into the neighborhood. The Zen practice at Page Street had nothing to offer the poor, disenfranchised neighbors. No money, no self-defense, no visible power. It was hard to figure out how to be helpful. Some neighbors complained that these newcomers made it harder to park. They were being called rich, self-involved hippies who didn't care about the problems of the local poor. The Sangha quickly learned that the doors to the building had to be locked. Neighborhood children figured out right away that the Zennies were suckers. They would roam the building at will. Things were stolen. One day, 3 tough black teenagers came in the open door and were having fun being sassy to a few students who were trying to be good, non-discriminating liberals. Suzuki approached in his robes, carrying his short teacher's stick. "Hey, the man in the robes, you know karate? You fight?" One of the teenagers demanded. Suzuki's eyes lit up, and he walked right up to them, short, unthreatening, yet full of spunk. "What's the stick for?" the biggest one asked. "To hit you with," said Suzuki, and whacked him on the shoulder. Then he escorted the boys to the front door while they laughed and sparred with him. My original motivation in coming here was not only to propagate Zen in America, but also to revitalize Zen in Japan. They are sleeping. Peter Schneider and Suzuki were hunched over a couple of sheets of paper. Shunryu Suzuki, Curriculum Vitae, was written in large letters at the top of the first. With Kobun's help, Suzuki had reluctantly prepared a chronicle of his externally significant achievements for Peter, whom he had also reluctantly allowed to interview him about his past. Peter, Zen Center's historian, had been editing The Windbell and was considering doing a book on Suzuki someday. The curriculum vitae was a pretty dry document. There was a line or two each for public schools, Komazawa University, Eiheiji, and Sojiji monasteries. It listed his years as Zonin and Rinsoin and positions he'd held at various other temples, and it mentioned the certificate he'd received to teach ethics and English. It was all new to Peter, who was asking Suzuki various questions. Suzuki was not very interested. His mind wandered. He was not always articulate, and he made little mistakes with dates and details. Peter kept trying to figure out when his teacher had become a Zen master. 10 times during the interview he asked. Suzuki would point to the resume and say, "Here, no, maybe there," or he'd get back to the previous topic. Any priest in Japan who had completed his training would be considered a master to his disciples. There was no word in Japanese that corresponded to the way Zen master was used in America. With Soto Zen, in Japan the title Roshi was a formality, but good teachers were known by reputation or personal experience. Suzuki's omissions in recalling his life were noticeable. He hardly mentioned his family. He talked about how his second and third marriages were opposed by some Rinsoin members, referring to them as his first and second marriages. He never wanted to talk about his past unless he thought it would help in some way. It was unimportant, private, and sometimes embarrassing. What Suzuki enjoyed talking about most was Nona Ransom. When Peter asked about her, Suzuki started laughing and said, "I must tell you about Miss Ransom. She was my old girlfriend." He said she gave him the confidence to teach Westerners. She had died, and he was sad about it. He regretted for the past few years he hadn't answered her letters. I thought it might be all right not to write her, but that was my mistake. She passed away last year. I trusted her very much, and she trusted me so much, so I thought whether I wrote to her or not didn't make much difference. But now I don't know. As long as she was alive, it seemed all right. Now I regret a little not writing to her. After Suzuki had talked a good deal about his struggle to become abbot of Rinsoin, Peter asked about the use of the material. Peter: "Do you think it would be interesting, Roshi, for the students to know all this, or is it best to keep your biography very simple?" Suzuki: "Maybe so. It doesn't make much sense, though. I'm afraid if they don't understand what was going on in the background, it will just confuse them." Peter: "I'm trying to decide how much should be included from your history. It's interesting to your students, but also maybe..." Suzuki: "No, maybe interesting for someone who is not a student. Because of these kinds of experiences, I decided to come to America. There's nothing interesting in all this. This is just a record, just confusion. My life in Japan was spent fighting and struggle. Fortunately, I knew how to handle the problems most of the time, but fighting just made for more difficulties. I was a very impatient and angry person, and I always started fights because of my impatience. Once I started to fight, I had to become very patient, or else I'd lose that fight and it would be endless. I always won the struggles, but that is not the best way. It is better to surrender. If I had known the truth about American life earlier, it would have been sayonara to Japan a long time ago, like this, waving goodbye. In answering a question about patience, Suzuki got a little impatient and expressed his frustration with the whole point of looking at his past. Suzuki: it's a big job talking about all this. I'm not interested. I have no accurate record of my life, and I don't want any. Peter: is there any meaning at all in having something about you in the windbell? Suzuki: this sort of thing? Peter: some sort of history, some biography, not too elaborate, but something. Not a book, though, maybe about 4 or 5 pages. Is that a mistake? 4 or 5? Peter: well, how much do you think? 1, half a page, a paragraph, 1 sentence? What about your biography saying only, I do not think much of this sort of thing and have not kept any records into biography? How do you feel about this? Suzuki: I didn't get answers to these kinds of questions from my teacher. I don't have much interest in it either. If my life is seen in this way, everything will be lost. Comments on Chapter 16 of Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki, The City. So there's mention here of Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder. In the book it says Allen is sort of the poet laureate of the beat. Did I really intend to make that singular? So anyway, I changed it to beats. Poet laureate of the beats. Of course, I don't know if the Beats, those people who were the Beats, considered that, but anyway, he was considered that in general. Worldwide, he was quite well known. Still is. And it mentions Gary Snyder's horse pasture hermitage. No. Yeah, it does say that. But it shouldn't be horse pasture, it's horse grove hermitage. I'm sure, I was just thinking of Tasahara's horse pasture and wrote it and just never caught it. So it was the horse grove hermitage. Mainly it was called Marinan. But it wasn't called that by a lot of people, just a few close friends of his knew it. It wasn't like a public zendo, but it was one of the first zendos in America. And you notice when Ginsberg goes to India later and then Japan, and Snyder turns him on to Zazen, he's pissed off at him for not having told him about it earlier. But anyway, it wasn't his trip. He used to come sit at Zen Center a little, but he liked, as it says, he liked chanting. He liked participating. He liked chanting and playing his harmonium and, doing blissful type stuff. He was a really nice guy. I mean, that was my experience of him. He was, I don't know if you'd say naive. I don't know, naive. He was very open, and he'd say to somebody, well, have you had an enlightenment experience yet? Have you experienced the clear light? He was very influenced by, stuff he'd read about Hinduism and Rinzai Zen and the whole psychedelic thing. But he was a sincere Buddhist. I read once, somebody said, I think it was Aiken wrote that only Snyder of the Beats practiced Buddhism or Zen or took it seriously. That's not true. Allen Ginsberg was very serious Buddhist. And, he got involved with Trungpa but I'd go there to visit Trungpa's place, and Alan would be there. He'd be living there. And also Philip Whalen was a very serious Buddhist, and so was Jack Kerouac. He didn't practice with a group, and he lacked in teachers or whatever. But it's really hard to judge other people's practice or their path. And Kerouac, he went downhill toward the end of his life. But so do a lot of people who get involved with good teachers and live in monasteries and everything. Everybody's path is different. I don't see it in terms of this one life. We have one life to live. I see this life as part of a bigger picture. But I don't see the bigger picture. But that's the way I see it, and it's not like I hope it's that way. I really experience it as that way, but not in a way that I can describe, and I don't really know quite how. It's a mystery. I'm in the dark. Yeah, Kerouac sat at Marin An. It says, Marin An, which means Horse Grove Hermitage. April. Kerouac arrives in California and settles into Marin An, Japanese for Horse Grove Hermitage, a small cabin owned by Gary Snyder at 370 Montford Avenue, Mill Valley, California, just east of Mount Tamalpais State Park, on land belonging to Locke McCorkle, a carpenter and a Buddhist. From The Ultimate Illustrated Beats Chronology by Robert Niemi. Locke McCorkle. Well, he was somebody who Joanne Kiger would mention and other people would mention, who goes back into that era before my time. It says in the book that when Suzuki was at the Human Bee, I was there incidentally, that was neat. It says he saw Owsley parachute in, but, that didn't happen. That was just something I threw in there because that was the rumor. That's what we all believed. Everybody said, yeah, and Owsley parachuted in. You know who Owsley was. He was the guy who made, 10 million tons of LSD. And he used to stay at the Panama Hotel where that Katrinka helped run in San Rafael, but he lived in Australia, and he was a real character. I didn't know him; I never met him, but I've heard a lot about him. He was against vegetarianism. He thought it was like he thought of vegetables as like poison or something, and he was just into eating, meat, and I don't know how that came about. But, and then he ended up getting a quadruple bypass. He lived in Australia for many years, and he died in a car crash, as I remember. He was also the Grateful Dead sound man. He's the one that created the Wall of Sound. So anyway, that's a real diversion there. But the Human Being, that was really something. I only saw one bad thing happen. as I was just arriving, there were a bunch of Hells Angels there. San Francisco Angels, which they weren't the bad ones. The bad ones were the Oakland ones, and the Oakland ones were really bad. And I'm not going to get into that. San Francisco Angels, well, maybe they were bad, but, if you behaved yourself around them, they wouldn't bother you. But, I walked in there. There's a bunch of angels standing around, and, they're part of the scene, no problem. And some stupid guy starts yelling and cussing at him, I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he was angry and he was yelling at him and he wouldn't go away. So they gave up and beat the crap out of him. I walked on and went into the crowd, and I didn't go in the car that took Suzuki. I can't remember who did that. Tim Buckley, maybe? But, oh yeah, we really wanted him to go. And, Oksan, anytime we wanted to take Suzuki somewhere, Oksan would be against it. Oh, no, he should rest. God, it's like it was in some movies somewhere where they're always saying, no, they need to rest. And he frequently deferred to her, but he didn't in this case. And, it was some event. So it talks about, it mentions this new student arrived and wanted to live in Sokoji, wanted to live in the building. He arrived, he said, I'm going to do it, and he wants to live there in the building. And then Suzuki says, well, you can't live here and make everybody jealous, but look, if you can come early and we'll clean. So think of that. Suzuki gets up and cleans with him early. You know who the student was Ruvain Ben-Human, a.k.a. Robert Front. Actually, Robert Front was his birth name, but he was calling himself Ruvain Ben-Human. And he was a super character. And listen, I have a lot to say about him later when I start reading a Tassara Stories stuff. But so think of it. Suzuki gets up. Zazen, when Ruvain came, Zazen was at 5 a.m. The first one, there were 2 Zazens. So Suzuki gets up like early so they can clean at 4 a.m. He did that for one new student. Good Lord. Man. It mentions Joe Kamiya, and it says how Joe Kamiya was doing electroencephalograph tests of students and various people, meditators, coming out of the Langley Porter Institute. The Langley Porter Institute, founded in 1941 as California's first neuropsychiatric institute, University of California at San Francisco, UCSF, Langley Porter Psychiatric Hospital and Clinic. So it's just part of that big hospital up there. So Joe Kamiya was testing people, and it says, like Suzuki and Katagiri go to sleep when he hooks them up and checks them. But Richard Baker and Mike Murphy, he said, had theta waves, which he was getting from long-time meditators, from, Hindu and Buddhist, and is associated with really deep meditation. Mike Murphy owns Esalen Institute, and is one of Richard Baker's closest friends. Right now, I'd say he's Richard Baker's closest friend, or he was. For many, many years. And Baker still is going there sometimes and doing, workshops or participating in workshops, even though Esalen, I don't know what's happening with the road now, but the road was all washed out. It was really hard to get there. And it's sort of in recent years changed from being that more public place with the roads open to a more limited function. Terrific place. And you can hike from Iceland to Tassajara in about 9 hours. I've done it. Yeah, well, maybe 10, because once you get down on Highway 1, you got a ways to go. But I don't know. So my source for Joe Camilla saying that is that he told me that personally, because he would come down to Tassajara as a guest. He said in there, ironically, in Japan, Buddhism had never been pacifist. And then it said, and all Buddhists had supported the government's wars. That I've changed. I said, and all Buddhist sects had supported the government's wars, as had all organizations, religious or secular. And I added that last part, everything, all the organizations. But you can't say all the Buddhists did, because there were individuals, very few, who didn't support it publicly, or so that they were put in jail, or I don't know if any were executed. There's Brian Victoria wrote about one Japanese priest who opposed the militarism strongly. And as I recall, he was a Soto Zen priest, and he died mysteriously. But I think everybody else there were sort of COs there, and people who refused to go in the army, and they had to go to prison. And prison in Japan you do not want to go to, especially during the war. And you do not want to go there now, I'll tell you. Hey, just do a web search for what is prison like in Japan. It's unbelievable. It's like a really strict boot camp with no let up. Being in prison in Indonesia, where I live, from what I've heard, and I know from here, and I know a few people who've been in prison here because of the drug rehab stuff I've been involved with, is a country club compared to Japan. I played tennis with a woman who learned tennis in prison. And, Suzuki wasn't opposing the militarism after the war started. What they were doing at Rincewind was much, much more subtle, was providing a place where it would, more open for people to express themselves in ways that were possible then. One thing is that, some Nichiren Buddhists got hold of me and said, Nichiren Buddhism opposed the war. And, the leaders of the Nichiren Shoshu sect opposed the war. And I said, I'll correct that, and this and that. But, I looked into that, and Brian Victoria has written about that. And, no, they didn't oppose the militarism of the war. They opposed putting the emperor and Shinto above Buddhism. If you had Buddhism on top, then the war is okay. Saying they opposed, it became like law that they had to put a certain object, I can't remember which, of some sort on their altars that stood for the Shinto and the emperor and Amaterasu or whatever. That's what they were opposed to, and they went to prison opposing that. But it wasn't opposing the war. And Brian Victoria he's like a bloodhound sniffing out the purity of people's opposition, and he's especially on the lookout for and suspicious of, until proven innocent, anyone opposing it for really being against war. He thinks, D.T. Suzuki, if you read what he wrote, it was that he knew Japan couldn't win it, but and it doesn't say if he thought Japan could win it, he would be against it. But people who knew D.T. Suzuki, and if you look at the total of his life, he did not like it. He also did not like the emperor. I know through Kano Sensei. I mean, he said the emperor had absolutely no sense of the spiritual. But, he did write some stuff about war and stuff that was not too philosophical and equivocal, and, it was too zen. He didn't really take a clear stand. Sort of had his head in the clouds. But still, I don't think of D.T. Suzuki as someone who would have supported any war with America, and who, I'm sure, wished Japan wasn't in any war and wasn't being controlled by militarism. So the student who was saying, she said, Roshi, can't I consider my practice to be helping people? There's so much to be done, and I don't have time left over to sit zazen. For Suzuki would now and then say that your efforts to help others are not necessarily going to help them, and the most important thing is to get yourself together first. So that student was Jeannie Campbell, Dan Welsh's sister, who suffered from depression and ended up committing suicide. Very sad. Yeah, when we get to the event that happened at Sokoji, where John Steiner asked that question. Well, actually, it was Ron Browning in back who said, "What are we doing here when there's a war going on over there?" That was Ron Browning, who had applied to be a conscientious objector and was disowned by his father, a dentist in Dallas, for doing so. Ron ended up getting ordained and going to Japan, ordained as a priest. And he was, had a very strong purism thing. And so he asked that, but Suzuki didn't hear him well. And then John Steiner, who was sitting in the front, clarified it. And Suzuki just blew up and started whacking him, going, "You fools, you fools." And, later apologized and told John it had just brought up his frustrations in the war. But also, he could see that, as he said, how do you think you can, save the world if you can't tie your shoes? But then he went and joined in on the Peace March. But it's interesting, because like he told his neighbor, the young neighbor he'd come talk to at Rinso in Japan, that he wanted to go abroad, go to America and teach peace and internationalism. Well, he was younger then and more naive. But, that was the 50s. And he came to America in 59. But, once he comes to America, he just starts learning and evolving. And he's changing a lot because of his students are influencing him a lot. And that was definitely not true of all Asian teachers who've come to America. A lot of them just stayed who they were and taught usually, and without learning English, or even if they learned English, they didn't learn from their students as much as Suzuki did. Brian Victoria said, his teacher at Komasawa, Yokoi, who Suzuki had wanted to bring to Tassajara and had a lot of respect for, and he's the one who said to Brian, he said, "Gosh, he's started a monastery over there. He's just a a country priest. He wasn't an elevated Roshi to do something like that. But he also told Brian, that isn't in the book, that he'd changed a lot. That when he came back, he'd changed a whole lot, and he said he's obviously been influenced by working with his students in America. And this is very true. So anyway, before he goes over there, he has this idea of teaching peace and internationalism. But when he arrives, that territory is covered. We're already into that. And that's not the teaching we need, is what he discovered. And then Barton Stone comes to Suzuki, like in 1960, and talks to him and going on this peace march. And Suzuki's very supportive, and Barton goes on this peace march from, like, here, let me look it up. Anti-war activists marched to Moscow for peace, 1960-61. Goals to educate the masses about the dangers of nuclear testing and to convince governments throughout the world. On December 1st, 1960, just after a rally in San Francisco, 10 members of the Committee for Nonviolent Action marched out of the city, intent on marching across the country all the way to Moscow and the Soviet Union. Their chances for success were slim, despite the backing of the admittedly small CNVA, Committee for Nonviolent Action. Marching most of the way around the world is a monumental task. Even if the distance were not an issue, the Soviet Union was notoriously unsympathetic to peace groups or protest action in general. Breaching the Iron Curtain would not be easy. Anyway, you can read about that online. And you know what? I'll talk to Barton about it. We're going to talk soon. And I'll have a phone chat with him, and I'll get him to tell about that. But it's very impressive. And then Suzuki goes and visits him twice when he's in prison for opposing nuclear testing. Obviously, we'll find out what he did to get in prison. Just opposing nuclear testing won't put you in prison. Richard Baker was involved in some of that stuff, too. I got it right here about how Zen Mind Beginner's Mind came about. First, Marion got permission from Suzuki to Marion Derby in Los Altos to record his talks and to transcribe them. Marion was a strong-willed woman. She didn't wait she wasn't a follower. I mean, she was a follower and a leader. She did both. But, she, good Lord, she'd only been around, she hadn't been around a whole year when she started doing that, but she was into it. And then her father, drives Suzuki to the city and asks him, what's your goal in life? Do you have some goal in life? And he says, oh, yes, I'd like to write a book. So her father tells Marion that, and bang, all right, let's do a book. And, Marion is the sort of person that's irritating to leadership because she's coming through with leadership-type ideas, but she's down below. I have the same problem. We're irritants. But we also fit in different ways. I mean, she wasn't ostracized. But I remember when she brought the book, the manuscript to Tassajara, and I remember, Dick getting it from her, and people were going, hey, that's Marion's book, it's sort of dividing into factions. And, those high mucky mucks up there taking that away from her, or some little bit feeling like that. But, later I find out that Suzuki and she had talked about it and arranged for Dick to have it. And, of course, she was, she didn't want to part with it. She wanted to do it, but that's all right. She did her part. And, but in the afterword to the 40th edition of Zen Mind and Beginner's Mind, I, off the top of my head, off memory, wrote that she started taping as a result of that conversation her father had. But Viktor Sergeyev, one of the translators into Russian, wrote me about discrepancies in that afterward because they were translating it for the Russians in my beginner's mind. And I looked into it, and he told me, and he also, checked it against Crooked Cucumber and told me that the two accounts are different. And I looked into it and went, oh, my God, I should have checked. Thanks a lot. No, the book's right, and the afterward's wrong. So, and he corrected other things in the afterward and other things in the book. And if you go to zmbm.net, that'll take you to the Zen Mind Beginner's Mind section on cuke.com, and you can read the 40th. You can read the afterword, and with his remarks, there's a whole page for him and his remarks, the corrections that they came up with, like they found out the height of the waterfall at Yosemite was incorrect. I mean, they checked everything. That they are now translating. He just got hold of me recently. They're translating the afterword I did for the 50th anniversary issue of Zen Mind Beginner's Mind, in which I took the 40th and just edited it, and made some additions, like I didn't know about Steve Jobs' relationship to Zen Mind Beginner's Mind when I did the 40th. So anyway, that's what happened, and thanks to Marion's father. And the other thing is, remember she titled it Beginner's Mind. Incidentally, her Beginner's Mind is on cuke.com. You can find it that same way. And she just had 13 lectures there. And there's a whole story about how I got that, too. That was quite a process of getting that book, because there was only one copy I knew of, and the person was clinging to it, saying that was Toni Johansson, who figured prominently in an earlier chapter. She got a little out there, and she was living in a cheap hotel room. She was a lawyer. She'd become a lawyer in downtown San Francisco. And she was saying, well, I don't know, David. It's the only thing I have to remember Suzuki Roshi. Or she might have still called him Reverend Suzuki or something. And so I had to deal with her over a period of time and interviewed her. That came out in the interviews for the book. But anyway, it all worked out. I'm not going to tell you the details of the rest of that story some other time. So how did it become Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind instead of Beginner's Mind? Well, when Richard Baker went to Japan, first he tried to get Tuttle Japan to publish it. Interesting, he went to Japan to get it published. I mean, he was going to Japan anyway, so I thought, well, I'll try to get it published in Japan. But such an interesting idea. It never would have occurred to me. I would have thought of an American publisher. But they were companies that published in America, Tuttle and Weatherby, Weatherhill, owned by Marcus Weatherby. So he was turned down by Tuttle, or something didn't work out with Tuttle or something. And then in Tokyo, Marcus Weatherby loved it and put Dick up. And, Dick finished the book then. But Weatherby said he wanted Zen in the title. And so that's how it became Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And then it tells about Trudy's sad but inspiring last days. The analyst who she was meeting with, who reported that, she was had a lot of fear and anxiety that she wasn't letting people know as she was approaching death, and then said she came to him like soon before she died for another meeting, and that she was transformed, radiant, brave, no problem. And that analyst was Sterling Bennell, who died a few years ago, a brilliant, wonderful, interesting person who I will be telling you more about when this book is through and I'm reading Tassara story stuff. In Suzuki's eulogy, very touching eulogy for Trudy Dixon, he talks about a person of joyful mind is contented with his lot. And he goes on about that, and he mentions the compassionate mind is the affectionate mind of the parents. He talks about that. And then the magnanimous mind is as big as a mountain. Those three minds he's referring to are the three minds that Dogen said the cook has to have in his instructions to the cook, the Tenzo Kyokan. And the one for the parents, Suzuki would also call that grandmother mind at other times. Yeah, I was sorry. I missed that. I missed Trudy's memorial. I was studying Japanese intensively in Monterey, and it conflicted with something I had to do. And I was going there for the weekends, and I should have gone. I wish I had have, but I missed it. It's one of the real high points, or what would you say? The high energy points of Suzuki's life in America, that people talk about, or that, when I've interviewed people, it comes out a lot. I'd say the three most referred to moments are that. The other one in this chapter where he blows up at a lecture in the city over war, and the question about that. And the third is, and the most mentioned, is his last public appearance at Richard Baker's mountain seat ceremony, where Suzuki came in. We'll get to that here in the book. Now, here at one point, we quote Suzuki saying, "When you try to do something, you lose it because you are concentrated on 1 out of 1,000 hands. You lose 999 hands. Before you try it, you have it." Now, I'm sure many know that refers to the 1,000-handed or 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. There's also the 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed Avalokiteshvara. One of Avalokiteshvara's many forms, able to multitask more than I can. But actually what he's pointing out here is that we do have 1,000 hands. But if we're just concentrated on one, then we can't, we lose the other 999. Oh, there's another side to that. Suzuki would also talk about the importance of doing one thing at a time, concentrating on what we're doing. Oh, you see where Suzuki's dealing with the leadership, the board of Sokoji, who've told him, hey, this is too much. You got to choose between us and them. This is overwhelming us. I'm personally very sympathetic with them. It was time to go. It's their temple, and anyway, he really wanted to try to do both things, and he always wanted accommodation and all that, but really, it was time to go, and he just let the circumstances bring about that time for going rather than forcing it. And he says that they had a Meiji approach. He specifically said the Issei have a Meiji approach. Issei is first generation. First generation means they're the ones who came over. That's the oldest ones. And probably some of those who were children of the first generation, no, they'd be called Nisei, second generation. I'd say some of the older people, but not George Hagiwara, man. He was cool. I really liked George Hagiwara. I've been in his house. I've driven Suzuki there, I guess, to do a ceremony. I can't remember. But it was always good to talk to George. And, his father was sent over by the Meiji Emperor to start a garden in San Francisco, and a Japanese garden. So he created the Japanese garden in the Golden Gate Park. And George grew up in that home there. And, they lost it. I've talked about him before in prior podcasts. But he was a good friend, not just him. Hirano was a good friend too. And he was like George's age. I hear George's son was on a TV documentary recently talking about the Japanese tea garden. I'm thinking of trying to get hold of him. Who else said that first generation was Meiji? Tomoe-san, Katagiri's widow, said that to me. She said, that crowd was more traditional than they were in Japan, where she came from. She also said that Mitsu Suzuki Okusan gave her a hard time. And other people told me that more vehemently than she did, because Tomoe-san didn't complain. She just hinted at it. But that's just a tradition there that's hard to break sometimes, is people being hard on each other. And especially women being hard on their daughters-in-law, or women who are of a lower pecking order. I've seen it. I've seen it with friends of mine. I was shocked. Anyway. And I can remember saying to someone in Japan, and I've probably mentioned this in a prior podcast, I wish I had them transcribed, and then I could just search real quick for what I've said. That would be good. I was saying to somebody in Japan one day, God, you Japanese are so generous and friendly and kind, and that, to a fault sometimes. And that's true. It got to be where at first Elin and I were really enjoying their generosity. And then we learned not to mention anything we liked, or they'd feel compelled to buy it for us, because it wasn't always out of just altruism. It was out of a sense of duty. And, you have to get them at some point to realize you're living there and they don't have to treat you like somebody who's just arrived. But anyway, I'd say, oh, you're so wonderful in this and that. And more than once I heard, yeah, nice to you, not nice to each other. Oh, just a little something I wanted to mention when Suzuki said he was talking about, ornament. That's something he got from a guest. You notice here he says, we say our practice is the ornament of Buddha, even though students don't know what Buddhism is. Well, the word ornament he got from a guest. I remember when that happened. Some guest was using it, and he commented on it in a lecture. Oh, that's really, this is an ornament of our practice, and this and that. Anyway, when I was reading that the first time, I said ornament, and then I have to, say it again, ornament. You know what that is? That's a Texas accent. I used to say, oh, you know what a Texas accent, my sister and I would talk about it. We had to work when we leave at some of the Texas things, not saying when we get out. And one of them was saying A for O. and I come from Fort Worth, and people will call it Fartworth. And I used to say, put the fark on the corner of the table. Let's see, there's some others. I for E. I mean, I would say to people, and this was and my sister said this too, this is the hardest one to get rid of, is I for E. Get over here. And I'd ask people, do you have a pen? And they'd say, a pen? I'd say, well, a pen to write with. They'd say, oh, a pen. I can hardly say it still. That one's ingrained. There's a few other ones. And our father was into speaking correctly, and he did not like hickiness. I think he came from Hicksville. He came from Crescent, Texas, and he sort of presented some things in his background. I didn't realize until really recent years, like Katrinka and I drove over to Crescent, and they've sort of made the central square in downtown Crescent. It's very small. It's near Fort Worth. They've made it into a nice sort of boutique-y place that's sort of neat to go to with some nice old-fashioned buildings. And I realized I don't know if my father ever took me there. There was nothing. He didn't talk about it, nothing. And I know why, because he thought they were ignorant. He felt like he came out of ignorance, and he was pretty sharp too. And also he resented his father, who was really supposed to be an interesting guy, but died before I was born, playing bridge. Skipped a generation. I got into playing bridge. But my father's father was too generous. He bought his brother a house and this and that, so that when he died, my father was a freshman in college at University of Texas, and he really believed in education, and he had to drop out of college to pay his father's debts, something that I would never have done or even considered, although I had the opposite situation. Thank you, Daddy. Anyway, my father. You know what my father would grill me on? The WH words. That they're really pronounced like HW, and traditionally, it wasn't. In my father's generation, it was who. It wasn't who. It wasn't like HU. It was who. And he would grill me on pronouncing it right. Nobody did anymore. It was very much like Suzuki's father making him tie, way back at the first, when he was a little boy, making him tie his hakama. with a particular tie that none of the other boys did. It was embarrassing. Anyway, whoa, boy, getting off on a tangent there, huh? So let's see. Where were we? All right, so we're talking about Peter in this interview. Oh, God, did I work a lot on that interview? Oh, trying to understand what they're talking about. I am eternally grateful to Peter for many, many reasons. For one thing, he's a really great guy, Peter Schneider. And he's a humble person. He's been into Zen forever, and he doesn't have any airs. Is what we used to say. He doesn't have any airs. He's not full of himself, and he's just real straightforward, nice, and everything. Anyway, he was the original historian of Zen Center, and I got a lot from him, but at some point he moved on to other things. And one reason is he was obedient. And Suzuki was not into that, as you see in this chapter. He wanted us to focus on things that were fundamentally important, not knowing details of the past. But so, there were several things that discouraged Peter from continuing. He was the original person who had an idea of doing a biography of Suzuki. But you can see right here, Suzuki says, it ends the whole chapter, him saying, if I'm seen in this way, everything will be lost. Everything I've done will be lost with me for nothing. Sorry, Roshi. And then the other thing that scared Peter away, I'd say, was he was there when they interviewed Noiri, which is mentioned in the introduction to the book. And Noiri's saying, no one should write about Suzuki Roshi who doesn't know all his samadhis. Well, that's how Peter put it to me anyway. So, actually, though, I have contacted Roshi. Now, this is not a joke. I have contacted Roshi through a very well-known, through a couple of psychics, through Fred Kimball, who was a great psychic who I knew for years, but I wasn't thinking about doing any of this biography, oral history, written history stuff then. But through Ann Armstrong and Jim they knew Suzuki, and that's the best. If I'm talking to a psychic who knew Suzuki, then the contact will be better. And for those of you that don't believe in this, of course I know this isn't true. Anyway, so she got hold of whatever's happening when they get hold of somebody. And Fred Kimball used to say, I don't know, maybe it's something I ate that does it. And, maybe it's just coming out of the, general memory of the universe or something. He didn't interpret it, and I don't interpret it either. Anyway, he was very appreciative of the work I'm doing. So there to Suzuki in a body. He said, thank you. He said it embarrassed him a little. Whatever that means. Coming through a glass darkly. So anyway, Peter, in the interview, Peter's asking over and over, is this when you became a Zen master? Is this when? And, Peter went on to live in Japan 22 years and learned things weren't that cut and dried. And I say here, in Japan, the title Roshi was a formality, but good teachers were known by reputation or personal experience. And I also say there was no word in Japanese that corresponded to the way Zen master was used in America. That's not entirely true. And it's not entirely true the way I said it. And, of course, my understanding of things is can certainly be challenged by people who know more. But I changed it to, in Japan, with Soto Zen, the title Roshi was a formality. Because Rinzai Zen does use the title Roshi more like what when we in the West say Zen Master. So, I changed that. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about the tapes. I have Peter interviewing Suzuki. Now, I might already mention this in a podcast, but since I don't have transcripts and can't search through them, I don't know. But listen, I do plan to get transcripts for all of them and maybe make the comments into something a little less, like a shaggy dog story, which is a term that Michael Katz used for Danny Parker's phone chat that went on for almost 3 hours. I thought it was fascinating. I mean, what a life this guy had. Anyway, so my comments are very undisciplined. Whereas if you work on something that's written and you start getting it in good form, the opposite happens. And I've also mentioned that in the podcast. So anyway, all right. So here's what happened with me working with the tapes, those interview tapes. In the first place, he sent them to me from Japan with other interview tapes. And it wasn't wrapped well enough. And some of them came apart. And I had to take them to a place and have new boxes built for them and have them reboxed. But that wasn't the big problem. The big problem was, first, he put the microphone on the speaker of the little office cassette machine. So until he moved that microphone, wow, was it hard to understand. But Catherine Thanis transcribed it before I did, and then I could check mine against hers. And oh, thank God, she did a great job. I was just really impressed. And but then the other thing is when he's talking to Suzuki, and they're talking to him about all these various positions he had that's on the curriculum vitae. I never know how to pronounce that. I even checked, but I don't know. That's good enough. He didn't identify him by name. He'd say, when were you here? And Suzuki would say, I was there. And so it was like, I spent a week just on the here's and there's trying to figure out what they're talking about and putting it together. Okay, I'm going to read you some from Suzuki's CV, curriculum vitae. Incidentally, I brought it up on Cuke.com by just writing CV in the site search box. Name in full, Shunryu Suzuki. Date of birth, May 18th, 1904. Age at time of filling out, 65. Family relation, first son of Sogaku Suzuki. Permanent domicile, 1400 Sakamoto, Yaizushi, Shizuoka Ken, Japan. Look, he fills out his permanent domicile somewhere where he didn't live the last 12 years of his life. Present address, 1881 Bush Street, San Francisco, California. Zen Soto Temple Sokoji. Education and training, 1924 to 26, junior and senior years of high school. April 10th, 1930, graduated from Komazawa University in philosophy of Buddhism and Zen. And one of the things they corrected for the Japanese translation, they said there was no such degree or anything. And so they just thought it was my mistake. But it was something that he identified that way. From September 17th, 1930 to September 2nd, 1931, head temple Daihonzan, Big Root Mountain, Eiheiji Temple. From September 18th, 1931 to March 31st, 1932, Daihonzan Sojiji Temple. You don't need the temple because the last G is temple, but that's for our sake. From March 1st, 1932 to January 30th, 1952, studied Zen under Ian Kishizawa. Now, I just wondered about that, why it ends on, did I say January to June 30th, 1952? I always wondered why it has that ending date, because Kishizawa didn't die till later. I say, well, did they have a falling out? No, I never heard anything about that. But anyway, will have to remain one of the mysteries. Ordination, Tokudo, May 18th, 1917, ordained on his 13th birthday by Gyokujun Soon Suzuki, was adopted by Sogaku, disciple of Father at Zone in Zen Temple, and lived there until 1924. From November 15th, 1925 to February 18th, 1926, at Kenkoin Zen Temple, Shizuoka City, during the full practice period under Daijun Kato Roshi. February 18th, 1926, Shuso Rishin, standing body, not considered a boy anymore. Boy priests think of him as young new friend. Dharma transmission, private ceremony, August 21st, 1926, from Gyokujun Soon, robe handed down to him from his Dharma master at Rinso-in in Yaizu, Shizuoka Ken. 10A, Okesa, January 14th, 1930. Public determination and consent from Soto Zen sect. Public ceremony, robe handed down. His name is listed by headquarters as one who can become chief priest of temple. After this ceremony, he goes to Eiheiji to meet with Dogen Zenji and to Sojiji to meet with Keizan Zenji, founder of Sojiji Temple, for ceremony 2 days. To go to vow to be good teacher. After this ceremony, he is Zen master and can teach anywhere and have a temple. All right, so that's where Peter decided, all right, here's where you become a Zen master. Well, it has some meaning. May 7th, 1932 to April 31st, 1936, Zen teacher Koshi in Bansho Zenren. Job belongs to Rinso-in. Kasui Sai at Fukuroi Shizuoka Ken. Kasui Sai. See, we have old motion picture of him there leading monks coming back from Takuhatsu, monks ceremonial begging. That was made by Miss Ransom, and it's on ShunryuSuzuki.com in the film section. It's pretty neat, pretty neat. He's leading the monks coming in. It's like a film from like 1935 or something. From March 1st, 1942, can't read this well, top cut off in copying. At that point, he gains a new status, only for ceremonies, apparently. March 31st, 1947, official director, Shike Daho, Tokoe in Temple. From June 3rd, 1947 until 1958, the teacher of Zen practice for both monks and laymen at Rinso-in. From June 30th 1952 until now, 1958, Chief Director of Dokan Takaogan Simon Soto. Docho Zenrin? Question mark. So I really didn't understand that. Through this period, his teacher was Ian Kishizawa Roshi. Experiences. March 1938, ordination ceremony for young female Buddhists of Higashi Eki Machi. No, it means Machi. It's misspelled. It should be M-A-C-H-I. That means town. Tenmura Shitagun Shizuoka Kim. That's like town, area, county, prefecture. March 1947, big ordination ceremony for lay members with Ian Kishizawa. Marriage in 1936, 2 years after Master died, when 33 or 34. 2 Dharma heirs, Roshi's son and son of his older brother, Shoko Okamura, who became abbot of Zonin. For him to pass the temple to his son needed to have transmission from Shunryu, entering as chief priest. January 22nd, 1929 at Zounin Temple, Mori, Shizuoka Ken. Ken is prefecture. You know, they're like states in Japan. April 23rd, 1936 at Rinsoin Temple, 1400 Sakamoto Yasushi Shizuoka Ken. That's when it doesn't say that, but that is when he was chief priest there, I think. May 22nd, 1959, appointed head priest of Soto Zen Temple Sokoji, acting chief priest until his installation as abbot in 1962. 1967, opening of Tassara Zen Mountain Center, Zen Shinji. October 1st, 1969, appointed Gondai Kyoshi by Soto sect. God, I can't remember what that means. On buildings and their repairing, March 1932, Kanon-do, where Avalokiteshvara is enshrined, and Seipin Kuri, not main building, but important building for guests and practitioners in Temple of Zonin. April 1944, Kaisando, Founders Memorial Hall, Ihaido, Priests and Laymen's Memorial Hall of Zonin. March 1st, 1958, renovated the main structure of Rinsoin, continued repairings of Kaisando, Ihado, Bell Tower, and Sutra Store Hall, Kyozo, until May 1958. Refused not to have exactly an old style, cost more, and everyone thought he was crazy, always studying architecture at the time Rinsoin was built, of the time Rinsoin was built, maybe 300 years old. No, it's more than that. On other works, May 5th, 1948, founded the Tokiwa Nursery School in Yaizu. No official title except responsible for religious education. April 1954, branch of Tokiwa Nursery School in Nishimachi, Yaizu. Interpreter for Miss Nona Ransom from August 1st, 1927 to May 30th, 1929. June 1931, license of ethical teacher for high school boys recommended by Shundo Tachibana, president of Komazawa University, which is misspelled. And then it has presidents of Sokoji Temple and successors of Sokoji. Oh, that's pretty interesting. To me. Founder of Sokoji, Reverend Hosen Isobe Roshi Daiju Hosen, December 8th, 1934 to summer of 1940. He came to San Francisco in 1933 from Los Angeles, Shuji. He went back to Japan. Successors of Sokoji, Reverend Kenichi Sato, August 1940 to April 1941, went back to Japan. Oh, he missed being in the internment camps. Gonna let this airplane pass now. Ha ha! I left some of the airplane in to let you know what it's like recording here. There's an airplane goes over every now and then. And there are more of them now that there's more activity, more people coming in. It's opened up a little here. 3. Reverend Daito Suzuki, Sogaku Daito, December 8th, 1941 to 1948. 4. Reverend Rien Takahashi, 1948 to 1950. 5. Reverend Hodo Tobasi, 1950 to April 1959. He wasn't there then, though. Went back to Japan in 57 or 58. 6. Reverend Shunryu Suzuki, March 4th, 1959. That's before he arrived. He arrived, I think, on January, February, March. I think he arrived on the 21st. Okay, so that's his curriculum vitae. Oh, and when I was saying, I was giving an example, they'd say, when did you do this? Well, it says when he did everything, so that wasn't a good example. I can't remember what questions he was asking, but there were things I wanted to understand which one they referred to. But Peter would just point to this list and go like, question, here. And he'd say, oh, there, blah, blah, blah. And I just kept listening to it over and over and looking at the sequence of what they were saying and figuring it out and put something together. Doesn't matter a lot, like he said. And then at the end they say, oh, there's one that's left out. Or there's a note on there, one that was left out. And there was a point at which I went, oh, I've got to find that out. But you know how I feel now? Nah, it's all right. Let it go. And more, that's how I feel. And even now I think, all right, I'm going to get through this. I'll get through Tassara's stories. I'll deal with city stories. That'll be it. Then I don't have to think about, then I can stop thinking about the past entirely. But really, it's not thinking about the past because it puts me in contact with all these people. It's so great, and I really enjoy it. But it'll only go on so long. That's one reason why I'm doing so much so quick right now. I know that this opportunity is limited, so I'm getting as much done as I can. Okay. In his phone interview, Suzuki says about Miss Ransom, she was my old girlfriend. And, he's using that loosely, but Don Lattin, religion writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, he wrote in his review of the book, which was very nice and really appreciate it, that it seemed like maybe she and Suzuki were lovers. No way. No way. Now, Japanese can be they can be promiscuous, and they don't have the Puritanism we have. They have their own type, but you can get away with stuff, especially, well, I shouldn't say especially. And, I do think that, but without any proof at all, but I just sort of assumed Suzuki and Oksan were lovers before they got married. I might be wrong. But I know Jane Hirschfield wrote Don Lattin a letter about that. I told her, well, I can see why he thinks that. He doesn't really have the picture of them that I do. Like, she's very proper. She's like twice as tall as he is. Or she's like a foot taller. And, their ages are different. And I think they had a teacher-student type relationship that, well, he's a houseboy and this and that. But no hanky-panky. Nah, can't see it. No way. That'd be too... They both have to be different people. Then he talks at the very end, or near the very end, about how he regrets a little not writing to her. It is very hard for me to forgive him for that. And that comes up more. He regrets a little. No, let me tell you, he regretted a lot. And this thing, we trusted each other, so I thought there wasn't any difference if I wrote her or not. God, man, everybody's got their problems and their weak points. And boy, that really zones in on his, as far as I'm concerned. Too many times, not doing things, not saying things that he did, like not telling his son that his sister has died. God. But look, you want to find a perfect guru? Please be my guest. I tell you, how Buddha's perfect and how he talks about Buddha's perfect. He's talking about the Sambhogakaya Buddha. I bet if we were back there, anyway, I've always wanted to make some film of the life of Buddha and just, have him being a person with lots of faults and things being messier than what we see now and then. The history of these things tends to be so idealized. And I know lots of Buddhists who take it all literally and just believe Buddha was perfect and he knew the number of leaves on all the trees in the world. Yes, that you can read, etc. And, we know that Buddha was a real person and lived. It's harder to prove Jesus was a real person. Maybe I'd say there's not court admissible evidence on Jesus, but there is on Buddha. But it doesn't matter. The two of them represent wisdom traditions that are very great. They're just hints. Suzuki says that over and over in different ways, all of it. It's just hints, and what's written and what's said is not what it's about. It's about you. It's about your essence. Anyway, that brings us to an end of comments on chapter 16. Thanks a lot for joining us for Chapter 16 of Crooked Cucumber with comments and tangents. If you'd like to help us keep going, especially in this time of the COVID-19 virus here in Bali, where we're called upon to contribute a little extra to help some other people keep going who depend on us and others, and the others aren't there. Anyway, if you'd like to help us, just go to the homepage of cuke.com, cuke.com. There's a donate button near the top, near the bottom. There's one on the Cuke Audio Podbean page, and just tap on it. You go to the donate page, and it'll show you how to zip a check to us or make a PayPal donation or become a PayPal subscriber for as little as $1 a month. Now, it's really easy to do, and Afterwards, you'll feel refreshed and happy. So this is DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita and Feline Cuchita and dear lovely Katrinka. And if you listened carefully, you might have heard the overhead ceiling fan during this time. Wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening. 1, 2, 3, 4.